Kristin R. Anderson is the Senior Director of Global Consulting and Evaluation for Corwin and has been personally trained and designated by Professor John Hattie and his colleagues at Cognition Education as a Visible Learning Master Trainer, serving as the lead Visible Learning Consultant for North America and Australia. Kristin began her career as a high school English teacher for students who were removed from Denver public schools. She has worked in multiple K-12 settings in various instructional and administrative roles and has obtained advanced degrees from Sterling College in Kansas, the University of Denver, the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. She's a longtime student of the field, a passionate educator, and an inspirational leader. Kristin has delivered professional development on various topics in teaching, learning, and leadership around the world. She's keynoted the Annual Association of Education Service Agencies Conference, has presented at the Association for Supervision of Curriculum Development Annual Conference, as well as multiple state-level agencies, including the Confederation of Oregon School Administrators, throughout a myriad of school districts across the United States, Australia, and Zambia. Over the past 6 years, she has studied the visible learning research under John Hattie and Deborah Masters. She's the author of Data Team Success Stories Volume 1, Real-Time Decisions, and co-author of Getting Started with Rigorous Curriculum Design with Larry Ainsworth. Kristin has worked to build extraordinary professional development programs for the Leadership and Learning Center. Please join me in welcoming Kristin Anderson.
Good morning. You know, all of that fancy bio and one very important piece left out. I kind of consider myself to be a resident of Missouri, maybe a co-resident, if you will. And the reason being, ever since I was in 6th grade, I spent my summers in Lamar, Missouri. Is there anyone in here from Lamar or the Lamar area? Pittsburgh, maybe, yes. I know you. No, I don't know you at all, but I had a best friend when I was growing up in Colorado, and she moved to Lamar, Missouri, and so every summer I rode a Greyhound bus to Lamar and spent several weeks there cruising the square. And so it is truly an honor to be with you, and one of my other favorite Missouri destinations that I've been to a few other times is Cooter, Missouri. And anyone from the Cooter area? I've seen all the hot spots in Missouri. Yes, absolutely. So such a pleasure to be here with you today. And up here is my Twitter handle as we're getting started, and I love learning with all of you on Twitter. So if anyone tweets, if you have questions, if you need resources, if there's anything I can do to support your learning journey, I promise you I read all the tweets and I reply to all of them post-event. So feel free to tweet away and be a twit. So I was straightening my hair the other day and noticed my hair is not straight at all right now. It's naturally curly and it gets super frizzy in humidity, so I just don't even bother. But how many of you have naturally curly hair and you have to straighten it? Yes, I know all the men are raising their hands in the audience. So most women who are afflicted and need to straighten their hair have this massive iron called a straightening iron, and it's two big hot irons that are probably about 12 inches long that can go up to 450 degrees in Fahrenheit, not Celsius, and they get pretty hot. And I was straightening my hair a couple of months ago, and I came across this warning label on the cord of my hair straightener. And even if you can't read all the words, the picture says 1,000 words, right? I'm looking down and I'm thinking to myself, who takes two 450-degree irons, puts them on their eyelash to straighten them? Who does that? How does that happen? What happened? And that got me thinking a lot about warning labels in general. And why do they exist, and who are the people that cause them? Could you just turn to somebody at your table and attempt to answer that question real quick? All right, wrap it up in 5, 4, 3. Now, I cannot pretend to be at your tables in your conversations, but I did hear a quote that may be appropriate to some of your responses, and the quote goes like this. It says, "I'm not saying that we should kill all stupid people. I'm just saying that maybe we should remove all warning labels and see what happens." And so as I was thinking about that and thinking about my hair straightener, I thought, what other warning labels exist out there anyway? And I started paying attention to, oh wait, I didn't want to spoil that one. This one. This is in Hawaii, on the island of Maui. And apparently there are invisible cows in Maui. Such a kind way of saying, hey, pay attention when you drive and look for cows. No, they're invisible. So in this one, this is a warning label for an ant trap. Just so you know, it may contain peanuts. So really, really, what happened here? So either one, you don't want the ants to go into anaphylactic shock, right? Or two, you were going to give your kid the ant trap to eat for a snack, but you decided not to because it contained peanuts. Either way, what the heck, right? And it keeps getting better. This one, it's in Florida. A picture says 1,000 words. I don't want to get near a crocodile, let alone molest it, just saying. And this 4-step process, if you encounter a mountain lion, just remember these 4 simple steps. Now, how many of you have children? Is keeping your children close really step 3? Just wondering. This one is too good. Now, for those of you who aren't aware of the person who actually ended up losing their life because they were so busy playing Pokemon Go and collecting Pokemon that they fell off a cliff, this one would be in place for them. And this is from the early iPod Shuffle. Number 1, music capacity is based on 4 minutes per song. And number 2, do not eat the iPod Shuffle. And I thought that must have been from a pregnant woman, right? Because who else is eating that much iron? This is from American Apparel. Warning, these tights are not pants. I'm sure you've never wanted to say that to anyone, ever, right? This one is on a plastic bag, just in case you thought it was a toy, it's not. And so make sure you don't use it as such. And then I think this one is really speaking to me. The use of this equipment is at your own risk. Even if you are in good health and are physically fit, you can be hurt or suffer a serious injury if you have and then it's injury, high blood pressure, bad back, or you're over 40 years old, or you have any other ailment. I turned 42 recently, and I didn't know that 42 was any other ailment, but apparently it falls in that category. And then I love this one. This is on a microwave food item. Warning, the food may be hot after microwaving. I would hope so. And so you could go on and on with this and the warning labels, but I was thinking about how you started your conference last night and thinking about envisioning the future. And if you were to be thinking about the future school year that's even ahead right in front of your face, what kind of warning label would you design when thinking about the future? And the future meaning it could be right after this keynote, the future could be now, the future could be this school year, it could be the next 5 years. But in the spirit of warning labels, if you were to design one for the future, what would your warning label sound like or look like? Go ahead and just have a chat with somebody at your table for about a minute and talk about what kind of warning label might you design. I could give you one that might spur some thinking, and it could say, warning, the future may contain nuts. I don't know, maybe not in Missouri, but somewhere else. So go ahead and have a chat with somebody and exchange your warning label. Go ahead and wrap up your conversation. Now, I will make a disclaimer that I did go ahead and research if there were warning labels or warning signs that were particular to the state of Missouri. And the only one that came up again and again was about equine deaths, and that it is not the responsibility of the owner for an equine death in some sort of showing. So I didn't quite understand the context, so I didn't include it, but you do have a very state-specific warning sign. Anybody have a warning label for the future that it's just too good, you have to share? You have to stand up and share it with everyone here. Can't let it go. I'm trained for wait time. I just want to make sure you can have a voice if you want one. Anyone? All right, well, we'll keep going. And so I made a warning label, and in all humor aside, in thinking about the future, something that's really striking me everywhere I go, anyone I talk to, is this notion of fear. It's something that seems to be riddling our country, riddling the state, riddling our world, riddling our schools, plaguing our teachers, plaguing our leaders, plaguing our kids in all different aspects. And the problem with fear, no matter what that fear may be, is fear ends up being incredibly harmful to the futures that we want to cause. We can have doubt, we can have anger, we can have manipulation, we can have control, but most importantly, fear gets in the way of all of us using our strengths to shine as brightly as we can in our schools and in our districts. Jim Knight, in his book, Better Conversation, says that when we worry about our needs, safety, freedom, control, power, integrity, peace, and belonging, we feel fear. Real quick at your tables, do a quick whip around. Everyone at the table, what is something that either your leaders, your district, or your students, or your teachers is afraid of right now as you move into this school year? What are some fears that exist? If there are any, what are some? Wrap it up. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I noticed that the volume in the room started getting larger and larger as the conversation happened. And I would come to you today saying that it is fear that gets in the way of all of the good things that you want to accomplish in your leadership position. Whether that is a focus on any given initiative, whether that's on instilling hope, whether that's in trying to create an environment of passion and learning. I got the privilege of attending the new superintendent's breakfast this morning, and one of the new superintendents said that one of their focus points for the year, or focal points for the year, was working on building trust. Trust with the board, trust within the system. And there is no greater perpetrator to trust than fear. In the wise words of Yoda, Yoda said, "Fear is the path to the dark side." Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. Now that sounds grandiose, but if you think about it in the school system, what does this look like? Fear leads to anger. Do we have any teachers that have been angry about anything ever? Anger leads to hate. What does hate look like when an educator is angry? Either it looks like outright defiance, outright misbehavior, outright words, or it looks like disconnection and apathy, right? And that leads to suffering. Suffering of the adults as they work with each other, but most importantly, suffering for those kids that we're given charge of with our over 500 districts and 900,000 kids in the state. So, right after thinking about the future and thinking about what is going on right in front of our face and thinking about the future that's ahead of us, I'm very confident that their future, the students' future in the state of Missouri, depends on all of us in this room and how we knit together a future. Right after the election, in feeling this face of fear, Seth Godin created or wrote a blog. And I don't normally like to read slides to you, but I think this one is very powerful, talking about how we kind of have two options right now in this state of fear. And he says, if we're actually powerful, if our voice, our effort, and our contribution matter, it's time to get to work. This is enervating. It would be so much more comfortable if it were up to someone else. Whatever system we are living in or with, it would be nice if it were responsible for what happens next. On the other hand, knowing that we can connect, publish, inspire, lead, build, describe, invent, encourage, and especially teach, it means that there is no one better than us and no time like right now. Of course, it's frightening, but it's important. And it's our turn. And so when I'm thinking about taking that charge and leading into the future, I was talking with a friend of mine, and he was telling me about how he does not look at the future as something that's always waiting for us. He gave some really good advice, and he said, actually, Kristin, the way I see the future is that we're stitching iterations of today or the present together to carve out the future that we really want to see. And those stitches in time actually eliminate fear when we're stitching together those things that give us great certainty. Warren Ellis, a futurist, he said it this way. He said, to be a futurist in pursuit of improving reality is not to have your face continually turned upstream, waiting for the future to come. To improve reality is to clearly see where you are and wonder, how can I make that better? And that is where the work of this man comes into play. How many of you have heard of John Hattie before? Yeah, he's kind of the thing right now, right? All the rage. And he's just amassed the world's largest research database of all time and what works and doesn't work in education. He's no big deal at all. But he wanted educators to have confidence and certainty that what they were doing in the present would create a future that we were certain would move student achievement. That the things that we're working on in the now, do we know for certain what our impact is and what the impact of those practices will be in the future? And so he's collected almost 30 years of research at this point on the practices that we all embrace in teaching, learning, and leadership to help arm us with ammunition to know what we're working on in the present and if it will make that impact we want to see in the future. The best thing about being in teaching and learning and leadership right now is we no longer have to guess. We no longer have to guess. We know what works best because of the collection that John has amassed. And in their book, Visible Learning Literacy, Doug Fisher, Nancy Fry, and John Hattie say it best when they say, every student deserves, I don't know what just happened there, every student deserves a great teacher, not by chance, but by design. And so when you think of success happening not by chance but by design and making the present stitch together iterations to carve out a good future, then we need to focus on the research. In fact, there's a new study that just came out last week from the University of Washington that talked about leaders who embrace research. And it is said that leaders in educational systems through the course of this study that actually embrace research are the ones who are willing to look at their own practice, to look at their own leadership style, to get feedback and to make improvements individually. And they're the ones who actually embrace research more for the improvement of that practice. Whereas leaders who are not introspective and not committed to ongoing regular improvement or becoming a better version of themselves are not as apt to embrace research. And we know that all of those people are in the state of Kansas, they're not in the state of Missouri, right? So Visible Learning was published in 2008 initially, and it was John's collection at the time of research. A lot of people say, oh, John Hattie, he's this amazing researcher. Well, actually, he'll tell you he's an amazing collector. Some people collect precious moments. John Hattie collects research, and he collects a whole lot of it. So when he first published his research, it was on 150 practices in teaching, learning, and leadership. And he wanted people to know which of those practices work and work well, and which ones aren't maybe as much worth our time. So the initial collection was 800 plus meta-analysis, over 50,000 studies, and over 250 million students studied worldwide. At that time, there was nothing anywhere near that collection of research, and currently today, there is still nothing anywhere near that collection. Over time, he wrote many other books to help interpret and to understand that research, some of which you may have read, including Visible Learning for Teachers. And then this slide highlighting some of the other ones in the iterations therein along the way. The cool thing about John, and I say cool thing because it is absolutely mind-blowing, is he's still a collector. So those initial 150 practices that he studied, where he was trying to determine what works and what works best, he's continued to add to the research of all of those 150 practices every day of his life. I like to think of him in some dungeon or lair with multiple screens all around, and it's like a new research study comes in, and then the screen reads it, and it aggregates. And I asked him what all that whole setup actually looks like, and he showed it to me. It's on a flash drive. A tiny flash drive contains all of this, which is pretty amazing. But he continues to add to all of that research, and he's at over 1,300 meta-analysis today. Over 75,000 plus studies, over 500 million students studied worldwide, and now he has over 230 influences, so those initial 150 plus an additional 80. And basically, he adds influences as research comes out that's statistically significant enough to prove the impact of that practice one way or another. So over time, RTI has been added, or a lot of the technology-based learning that there is research to support has been added over time from that initial 150. What he found in his 150 practices is 95% of them work. He sought out because he sought out to do this collection because he wanted to figure out, why is it that we work in a field where everything seems to work? And we try everything as if it all works well. Well, when he conducted his research, he found out that indeed 95% of those 150 practices he studied work, and they work, they have varied effects. But the question isn't what works. The question is what works best. Because we can spend a lot of time trying to do a lot of things, which ends up in initiative fatigue or implementation fatigue. And we do not need to do that anymore because we have the evidence to help us and prevent us from making this type of decision making in our schools. We've all been there over the past where we've done everything we possibly can, and then when it comes time to state testing, we have our fingers crossed behind our back, hoping that something we did actually worked. We don't have to guess, and we don't have to hope anymore. We have the research to support us. So to get us into the research just a little bit, in these initial 150 practices, I have 6 practices here on this screen. Ability grouping, feedback, teacher-student relationships, individualized instruction, mobility, which is moving multiple schools in one school year, just so you know the further definition of shifting schools, and then student expectations of themselves. And what I'd like you to do, just with a colleague real quick, or on your own if you'd prefer, is to attempt to power rank these 6 practices in order of what works best to move student achievement to what doesn't work necessarily so well when it comes to making an increase on student achievement. So number 1, what works best? Number 6, what doesn't work so well? Go ahead and make an attempt to power rank them. You have 2 minutes. Fifteen seconds. All right, everybody have the answers? All right, everybody's got it figured out? So just as a reminder, these are 6 of the 150 initial practices John studied. They are not the top 6. They are not the bottom 6. You could be looking at number 1 and number 150. You could be looking at number 47. We don't exactly know where they sat in the final rank, but what we do know from this exercise is what works better than the other items based on this list. So if I could get a drum roll, please, because I feel like these are kind of important results that we're about ready to unveil. And here we go. Oh. There we go. How does that match with what you thought? Yeah? Did you guys get all the answers right up here? Awesome. Awesome. I knew you were amazing. Is there anything on this that surprises you? Are all fairly straightforward? One thing that typically surprises people is ability grouping, and the thought that ability grouping should be more successful than not, and that one we can get into in a little bit, or individualized instruction. Now, I'll remind you that you don't know exactly the impact of these practices, you just know in these 6 what works better than the others. So let's continue to learn a bit more. So when John collected all of this research, he only included a study if it showed an impact on student achievement. So a lot of people wonder, doesn't John care about the emotional well-being of the teacher or of the child? And, he's being insensitive when it comes to retention or some other things. John cares about people, but in order to have a means for the study, he had to only include studies that showed an impact on student achievement one way or another, so on international assessments and scores. And so besides that, there were 3 types of data collected in this massive study: baseline, endpoint, multiple points, comparative, and using a method called Cohen's D, he measured growth over time and differences between different aspects being researched. And all this to say, basically what he did was he took all of the research and all of the scores that showed an effect one way or another on student achievement for one practice, and he put them on a common scale. So let's pretend this is cooperative learning. So then he had a bunch of studies that showed an impact one way or another on student achievement for cooperative learning. He put them all on a scale, and using Cohen's D, he worked to calculate an effect size. So what he found in these calculations is that 0.4 is what's considered to be the hinge point. And the hinge point is equal to 1 year's growth over 1 year's time, or what John calls the moral imperative for every educator, and what as educators we owe our children, which is at least 1 year's growth over 1 year's time, if not more. So basically, if 0.4 equals 1 year's growth over 1 year's time, remember when I told you that what John found for those initial 150 practices is 95% of them work? Well, 95% of 150 work if your measurement is 0. If your measurement is 0.4, or 1 year's growth over 1 year's time, then it's less than 57 of those initial 150 practices that actually work and work well in that zone we want to be. And to illustrate this just a bit differently, here's how it works. Any one of those initial 150 practices that has an effect size between a 0.4 and higher is in that zone of desired effects. The 0.4 is what we call the standard deviation in the research, which simply means that if you multiply it by 2, you get 2 years growth over 1 year time. You multiply it by 3, you get 3 years growth over 1 year's time with an effect size of a 1.2. It's also true that if you half it and you get an effect size of a 0.2, that is the equivalent of a half year's growth over a year's time. So if you look at the blue zone, that's where we want to be. Effects that yield where we want to be for our kids. The green zone is labeled typical teacher effects, and that's any practice that has an effect size of a 0.2 to less than a 0.4, which is the equivalent of a half year's growth over a year's time for kids to a little less than a year's growth over a year's time for kids. Why do you think it's called typical teacher effects? The average teacher around the world gets less than a year's growth over a year's time for their kids. The average typical teacher. And that was kind of a mass through John's collection of research. Now, the yellow zone is called developmental effects. And this is any practice that has an effect size of a 0 where it barely works. It could have a 0.01, one tick above 0, to a 0.2. Or barely any growth to less than a half year's growth over a year's time. If a practice has an effect size that falls into this range, it is called the zone of developmental effects because that practice has the same impact as student maturation. Meaning you could put the Walmart greeter in the classroom with that child and they would get the same amount of growth as that practice would give them naturally because they're growing and maturing anyway. What's interesting about this zone is this zone contains a lot of those things that we spend a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of resource on. New buildings, new tools, new schools, new programs, all of those types of things that it's easy to spend money on barely gives us the impact we're looking for. And then finally, there is the red zone, the reverse effects, but there is less than 5% of those initial 150 practices are actually falling in that reverse effects zone. And as John says, there is very little that we do that really harms children. So that's the good news. And so as we continue to look at the research, I had you power rank those 6, and knowing that barometer of influence and what these effect sizes really mean, let's take a look at what the impact of these 6 practices truly is. Another drum roll, please. And here they are. So if you look at student expectations of themselves, that is ranked number 1 out of 150 practices that John initially studied, and it has an effect size of a 1.44, which, if you remember our barometer of influence, that is the equivalent of 3.5 years growth over a year's time. Whereas if you look at mobility, mobility is 150 out of 150 initial practices, and it actually has a negative 0.34 effect, which means that not only do you lose 1 year over 1 year's time, you actually lose 2 years because you lose the current year as well. Okay? Turn and talk to somebody. Any surprises on this list? And what does assigning that effect size do to the impact of these practices in your understanding? Wrap it up. 5 seconds. All right, so anyone interested in learning a bit more about this research and some of the findings? Anyone in the room? Yeah? Okay, good to know. So every effect that was calculated has a distribution of different assessment scores that go into the calculation of the effect. So some of them could show a blue zone effect, some of the assessment scores or outcomes. Some of them could show a typical teacher effect or a developmental effect or a reverse effect. And then the effect size is the aggregate between all of those. Okay, because there's a normal distribution from the studies. What's fascinating is every one of the 150 practices falls into the aggregate of this distribution, except retention. Retention is the only one of the 150 practices that there is actually no study in the yellow zone, in the green zone, or the blue zone, no study that shows any positive impact on student achievement over the last 30 years. Fairly interesting. So one of the nicknames that John Hattie has is Bob Marzano on steroids. And one of the reasons why he got that nickname is because Bob Marzano kind of started this practice in education, or kind of made it popular with classroom instruction that works or school leadership that works, right? And he studied a certain number of practices in the classroom, gave them effect sizes through a collection of research to help us know what works better in the classroom than something else. The reason why Hattie is called Bob Marzano on steroids is because he's not just talking about what the teacher is doing in the classroom. He's talking about the curriculum. He's talking about the student. He's talking about the home. He's talking about the teacher and the approaches to teaching and what the learner does. Therefore, making it so expansive that, as MC Hammer says, you can't touch this. So, one thing I want to kind of help you understand as you continue to look at this research is how to understand or interpret these tables, because all of the effect sizes are always put out in these tables. Now, it's easy to understand that the rank is the rank out of the initial 150 practices and the name of the influence. You have the number of studies that were taken into consideration to calculate that effect size. The one that I think is most interesting that a lot of people have a misconception about is the one called effects. And effects basically are the nuances that are studied within that practice. So if it is homework, okay, and we have a certain number of studies for homework, the effects are homework with secondary girls, homework with secondary boys, homework with secondary English language learners, homework with elementary school girls, et cetera, et cetera. And the higher number of effects, the more you can be sure that every extensive aspect possible that could be research was taken into account. So if you look at retention, 2,882 effects. Pretty darn impressive. So this slide kind of shows the real losers of the research. These are the biggest losers. These are those ones that make a child go backward over time. One of the biggest messages of John's research, and if you hear nothing else today, I hope it's this, is almost every practice above a 0.4 that is in that blue zone of desired effects, almost every single one of those influences is directly within a teacher's control and influence. Almost every one. So in other words, to put it in real simple terms, everything that gives 1 year's growth, 2 years growth, 3 years growth, over 1 year's time, 3.5 years growth, a new effect that I'm going to show you soon, 4 years growth over 1 year's time. Those are all about what the teacher controls or influences and causes in their classroom. That is huge. There has been large research over time from people like Doug Reeves or Katie Haycock who have suggested that no matter what a child comes to school with, no matter what challenges, whether it's poverty or reading levels or what's happening at home or mobility or whatever the case is, that none of that trumps the power of the teacher in the child's life. And this largest research database of all time proves that in spades. So every teacher that's sitting in any teacher's lounge in the state of Kansas, because it doesn't happen here, but in the state of Kansas, when they sit in those teacher lounge and they blame everyone else for what's happening with those learners, they do not have an excuse anymore to place that blame. This research dispels that, and you go all Taylor Swift on them and you tell them that you're going to shake it off because the research tells them otherwise, okay? Now, I just told you that what really moves student achievement is directly within the teacher's influence and control, but if you look at this slide, the worst possible effect size is mobility. So it sounds like I'm a total liar, and I am contradicting myself, and I am not. What we know about mobility from the research that sits underneath is, yes, it has a detrimental impact on kids. But there is something that educators can do that is directly within their control that can mitigate this negative impact of mobility significantly to the point where these reverse effects barely have an impact. Turn and tell somebody, what do you think it is that an educator can do to mitigate this negative impact of mobility? What do you think the research said? Wrap it up in 5 seconds. Honestly, it is elements like I'm going to share with you now that make this research so incredibly powerful to me, which is the more you dig into it and the more you learn, the more you realize that doing what's right for kids, what really moves kids, is one, directly within your control and influence, and is two, doesn't have to cost a gajillion dollars to implement. So here it is. What researchers tell us about mobility is if a child who is highly mobile has a peer that is assigned to them for their entire day over the course of their first 2 weeks, it significantly mitigates the impact of mobility. This child goes to lunch with them, so they always have somebody to sit by. This child helps them navigate their locker. This child helps them understand their teacher or their teachers and how to do routines and procedures in the class and make sure they always have a go-to person. Why does that significantly change the impact of mobility? It's because a highly mobile child comes in with walls up. Why would I connect with anybody? Why would I learn? Why would I let my wall down if I am going to move somewhere else? I'm going to protect myself. But if they make an emotional connection, and that emotional connection is incredibly powerful, they will let their wall down and the learning will occur very quickly. So, something to learn, doesn't cost anything, dramatically makes an impact. Want to learn more? Good. One person does, and I think Robin does as well. The one that I wanted to talk with you about being who you are in this room is the impact of principals and school leaders. Notice, school leaders, you are 1 tick below average. If average is 1 year's growth over 1 year time, you are 1 tick below average. Actually, what we've learned in the research is there's one group of school leaders who is above average, or who gets more than a year's growth over a year's time, and then there is one group who is below average. And we've grouped them into instructional leaders and transformational leaders. Okay, here are the attributes of these leaders. What I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and read these attributes of these types of leaders, and I want you to just have a conversation with someone sitting next to you. Which one, the transformational or the instructional leader, has the greatest impact on student achievement and why? Which one? Go ahead and raise the roof if you formed your opinion, just so I can see who's got an opinion. Half the room has an opinion, but yet everyone's talking. So what's up with that? So your task was to determine which of these leaders has a greater impact on student achievement, just so I can show. Stand up if you pick transformational. If you pick transformational leaders, stand up. Awesome. Very good. Thank you for all of your bravery, and have a seat. And then if you picked instructional, please stand up. Perfect. All right. Excellent. So a little bit more heavy on the transformational leader side. Which side's right? Well, let's see. Here is the difference in the research between the two. It's statistically quite different, yes. For those of you who are interested in the research behind this, a lot of this comes from a woman named Vivian Robinson out of the University of Auckland, who has researched all of the particular behaviors of an educational leader and has worked to assign effect sizes to each of those particular behaviors. You can Google a lot of her papers. They're free online with the results, or Jossie Bass has a book of hers called Student-Centered Leadership that also published all of these. But if you look at the big variance between these two, I understand all of you who picked transformational. I know why you did. Because you looked at the first few attributes: sets the vision, school goals, supports, Mission, vision, values, goals, energy, enthusiasm. It's the frickin' first chapter of the PLC handbook by the Dufours. That's what every good school leader does, right? We all know that. And there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, we want our leaders to do that. We need that from our leaders. The question is, where do you live after that? Where do you live after that? Do you spend your time managing the building, conducting reports, having meetings attack you as opposed to managing meetings? Or do you spend your time in the classrooms with the educators, planning, looking at data, looking at assessments, attending PLCs, having the academic conversations? I did this activity with a group of teachers who teach a 40% homeless population in Hawaii. And almost every single one of those teachers picked transformational leaders as the ones they thought had the greater impact on student achievement. And then one of them stood up, and I just admire this young man so much. He stood up in front of everybody and he said, I voted transformational leader because I feel like that's what I want. And he said, meaning I want someone who is the rah-rah cheerleader that makes me feel good, that supports me, that protects me, but doesn't get in my business too much. And he said, but what I realize that I need is I need somebody who is going to help me learn how to be a better educator and meet the needs of these kids. And someone who actually cares enough about my practice to talk to me, but it means that I have to be vulnerable. And I have to be willing to be open to that. Instructional leadership for the leader and for the educator is much harder, but it is the one that makes the greater impact. So in looking at Vivian Robinson's research then, let's look at a couple of other dynamics. Here are a few other behaviors of leaders that she also assigned effect sizes to. Resourcing strategically, ensuring an orderly and supportive environment, planning, coordinating, and evaluating teaching in the curriculum, promoting and participating in teacher learning and development, and establishing goals and expectations. All of those are important leadership behaviors. Some of them work much more effectively when it comes to raising student achievement than others. Go ahead with your neighbor and power rank them. Which one works best and which one doesn't maybe work so well? Five seconds. All right, and drum roll, please. Any shockers here? A couple things that I'll just say about this is the first one, let's look at that 0.27 effect size, ensuring an orderly and supportive environment. This fits in very well, actually, to the conversation about transformational and instructional leaders. I taught in urban settings. I understand that if you don't have an orderly and supportive environment, nothing else can happen. The question is, how quickly can we get to an orderly and supportive environment so we can focus on the instructional behaviors that need to occur in order for student achievement to actually raise, instead of continuing to focus on the safety and the security of the building. That's why when we talked about the transformational and the instructional behaviors of leaders, and we said, okay, transformational leaders set mission, vision, values, goals, they have the passion and enthusiasm, but then they get their butts in the classroom, okay? Or you ensure a safe and orderly supportive environment, but then you are privileging the instructional program, therefore you are transtructional, right? In nature, transtructional. And these results kind of lend to that. So, as Vivian Robinson said, she did say, basically what she said, I don't know what's happening. But basically what she said, whenever that slide decides it's going to come back up, but before that, so the question really is to ask yourself is, if you look at those instructional and transformational leadership behaviors, how much of your time do you spend every week in transformational versus instructional zones? How much of your time do you spend in classrooms? How much of your time do you spend interpreting assessment scores with teachers or school leaders? How much of your time do you spend leading or attending meetings focused on instructional issues, ensuring a coordinated instructional program, being highly visible around the schools and communicating high academic standards, and ensuring that the atmosphere is conducive to learning? You know, one tip that I work with a complex area superintendent in Hawaii, and we started working together on keeping track of her schedule and determining in her schedule what behaviors she has are instructional versus which behaviors she has are transformational. So she has instructional meetings coded in blue, and she has transformational behaviors coded in red. So then she looks at the week-long glance or view of her calendar, and if she's seeing a whole lot of red and not a lot of blue, it's an instant signal to herself to start really looking at how can she carve out more time for those instructional behaviors that really make a difference. So, and as Vivian Robinson said, she said, the more that leaders focus their relationships, their work, and their learning on the core business of teaching and learning, the greater the influence is on student outcomes. And a large body of research tied to that. The next one I wanted to talk with you briefly about is professional development. Notice it has a 0.51 effect size, or 1.25 years growth over a year's time. This is not one-night stand professional development. This is not drive-by PD. This keynote right now is interesting, I hope. It's thought-provoking. It gets you thinking, but it is not professional learning. Professional development is an act of obedience where you sit and you take in some learning. Professional learning is the actual practice of going back and implementing what you have learned and making sense of it and focusing it deeply. And so this type of professional development that has that type of impact has these attributes. It's over a long period of time, 3 to 5 years. Focusing deeply on a few things for 3 to 5 years to help teachers truly embed, to help leaders truly embed into their practice the behaviors that you are wanting to see. It involves external experts, but it also deeply involves building the internal capacity and capability of the people at your site. It challenges teachers' existing beliefs. It challenges their existing beliefs, and that part is really important because a lot of us sometimes as leaders, we think we need to get a certain percentage of buy-in in order to adopt anything, to do anything at our sites. But there is a study I came across recently by a research duo named Hills and Cohen, and they studied a 4-year implementation of a mathematics program in Adams County, Colorado. And as they studied this implementation of the 4-year professional learning around mathematics, they asked teachers every 6 months to rate their satisfaction levels during the professional learning they were engaged in. The results were astounding. The teachers who showed the greatest growth and change in their practice and who had the greatest gains on student achievement in mathematics were the teachers who rated themselves the most dissatisfied throughout the course of the implementation. I'll say that again. The teachers who had the greatest growth and gains for students and themselves were the most dissatisfied. Why? Because it was flippin' hard work. The only way growth happens is if we roll up our sleeves and do the hard work. Everything that sits at the top of this research requires us to dig deeply. To put it into real life terms, over the last year, I've lost 60 pounds. I have a ways to go, but it is friggin' hard. I've wanted so badly to buy the pill, to buy the program, to buy the meal box, whatever it takes to lose all of this weight and to have it happen super fast. And I've tried all of those things over the course of my life, but the one thing that has actually worked is being present every day, being aware of every food choice I make, and making sure I kick my butt to exercise even when I'm dragging and I don't want to. There's nothing sexy or beautiful about any of it. And in fact, most days, thank you. Yes, I agree. And in fact, most days, I just don't want to do it. But the best things that happen to us in life are the ones that are hard. The best things that change us are the ones that provide challenge. The ones that we stick to for the long term, and when we're in that implementation pit, we do not give up. The best learning is cognitive dissonance. And when we create that dissonance, educators aren't going to know at the very beginning that they're going to buy into something that they think is all going to be wonderful and beautiful. What they need to buy into is dissonance. They need to buy into the fact that they're going to work hard, that good things come with hard work, and then whatever you put them in regarding professional learning that you have picked that doubles or triples the speed of learning will get you the results when everyone has that mind frame and that disposition. So in closing, I do not know what is the deal with this clicker. I feel like if I nod my head with the clicker, it'll help. Head banging. There we go, there's one. How about another one? Yeah, okay. So in closing, I've put a slide up that includes some of Hattie's current 230 practices that he studied. Now, it used to be that student expectations, or the artist that started as self-reported grades, with a 1.44 effect size, where students own their own learning journey, and they can answer, where am I going, how am I going, where to next. That always used to be the number one. For the last 10 years, it's been the number one. There's a new number one, teacher collective efficacy, a 1.57 effect size. 4 years growth over 1 year time. Now that does not diminish the old number one. The old number one is still kicking and going strong, because 3.5 years growth over a year's time is worth every single bit of investment and hard work that takes. But teacher collective efficacy can be summed up as this. It is the belief that collectively teachers can get the maximum achievable result. That there is no problem that any teacher in that building can't solve. They have the vanilla ice mentality. If there is a problem, they will solve it. They own every child in that building. Every child. They don't view things in terms of my classroom and your classroom, or this team and that team. It is a collective energy that is fueled through purposeful experiences that create so much uplift that those educators know without a shadow of a doubt that whatever comes their way in that school, they may not know all the answers, but they know what they need to do to get them. And if you look at all of the items that sit at the top of this effect size chart, all of these pieces are directly within the control and the influence of the teacher and of the school leader. And whichever one you pick, you can't really go too wrong. It's a matter of aligning with the goals and the outcomes that you have for your building and the initiatives you have going on to determine where to double down. But as we talked about, if you want to create the future that you want to see, where every child gets at least 1 year's growth over 1 year's time, and a future where your learners are passionate and your educators are passionate, then we need to focus on those things that we know from the research, stitch together the best iterations of the present to carve out that future that we truly want to see. So I hope all of you become futurists and start focusing on what we know works and works well. Thank you so much.